Hello, my name is James Payne, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the MIT Sloan School of Management in the System Dynamics group. And I'm here to present my ongoing research on model-based versus model-free cost reduction in multi-echelon supply chains. Now, when we talk about supply chains, a lot of folks here probably think about operations management or operations research or even supply chain management. But in the last 20 years, there's been kind of this surge of interest in this distinct subfield of behavioral operations management. Of course, the 2006 JOM special issue on BOM, I think, kicked off a lot of this, though discussions around this have been going on well before that. And really what this amounts to is this idea that supply chains consist of and exist for often non-rational entities, where we're incorporating some concept of, again, behavioral within our operations frameworks and models. Something to note, though, about BOM, at least I think in my view, is that it focuses often on comparing sort of observed decisions that we see to some concept of optimal and commenting on how these observed decisions vary from some sort of optimized model or perfectly rational agent. And this really often additionally ignores kind of this larger dynamic decision-making that went into these supposedly non-rational decisions being formed. As you go through your life, you're not making a momentary optimization decision based upon the single action in front of you. Each of your decisions is nested into sort of a larger series of decisions that you have to make just going through your day and really planning for the future with the burden of your past coming along with you. And so really, I think a lot of this work has missed an opportunity to develop policies that incorporate rather than critique these supposedly non-rational actors. And that's really where this work specifically comes in. It's stated very broadly. This is an attempt to sort of challenge the clouds of those existing models and sort of policy construction methods by outright not just commenting on how something varies from rational, but outright expecting supposedly non-rationality or non-optimal responses in the individuals that make up a supply chain, make up an operations management, make up an operating system that delivers a good or a service to an individual. And when, of course, when possible, incorporate this concept of sort of dynamic learning into these policies, which is really the framework for how these actors have sort of come to these heuristic-based models. Now, to do this, we need something that is non-trivial in order to sort of encourage this sort of heuristic behavior. And so a good example of a dynamic decision-making environment with limited information availability is the classic multi-echelon supply chain, which I think for this group of people is not entirely unfamiliar. This idea that no one entity exists in a vacuum. You have your own suppliers and customers that exist upstream and downstream from you. And of course, when we talk about multi-echelon supply chains, we have to talk about bullwhip. When I talk about bullwhip, what do I mean? Bullwhip is the sort of structurally induced but behaviorally amplified feature of these environments in which a small perturbation in a signal is amplified and phase shifted downstream. Now, for this particular research, I can go ahead and use a sort of idealized or at least simplified version of a multi-echelon supply chain, and that's the beer game, which again, I think for this particular audience will be a very familiar modeling place. And specifically what I'm talking about in this research is what can we do to craft a policy, here represented by a little image of a desktop computer, a specific position within this multi-echelon supply chain that acts in a way that assumes the other entities around it are sort of doing their best based upon their own heuristic rules that they have in front of them. So in order to do that, we started with a behavioral ordering model, created a modular sort of sub system of the beer game, specifically a discrete time simulation that could then be allowed to be adjusted and modularized to have multiple different versions of these ordering rules based upon classic literature. Right now we have the classic Sturman 1989 rule, which will be the focus of most of the research today for the sake of simplicity and sort of general ease of understanding. More recently, Sturman Dugan's 2015 rule. There's Oliva paper from 2020 that recently came out that has another rule that can be placed in here. And of course, I'm currently working on the Corson and Donahue rule from 2006 as well. Additional just base stock ordering policies as well. But essentially what this allows you to do is take some rule, like in this case, the Sturman 89 rule, which consists of 4 parameters, and then use it to create a sort of a model of how people make decisions in this space in a way that reinforces and references itself. And so for this, we can then do an actual single shot optimization. So we can say that given this environment, that where people are making these rules, can we go ahead and then craft a policy based around these rules that minimizes cost within the space? So for some entity I in this 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4 in this 4 entity supply chain, fix an I, and then go ahead and find the values of, like in this case for the Sturman 89 rule, there's 4 parameters, theta, alpha, S prime, and beta, such that we minimize our cost. And sure enough, we can go ahead and create a single shot rule that, generally speaking, is cost reducing. And I'll note this later on, it's not universally cost reducing, but generally is cost reducing within the space. Something to note, though, we can even move a little bit further away from this, and we can say, well, why limit ourselves to this policy that's based on existing heuristic? Why don't we completely remove the model from the agent? And so to that sort of point, I created this DQN. And the nice thing is the construction of our environment earlier, which was modular, allows for a nice construction within this sort of action state pair that lends itself well towards the OpenAI gym environment, and additionally creating agents that operate within this sort of neural net space. This is some notes on the actual architecture itself. For those who are interested, I have a link at the end of this presentation with a little bit more details. But essentially, it's a 4-window view of the state space that you can see within this, that then goes into a specifically split action state pair system that keeps track separately of the value of the state and the value of the action state together. Now, mathematically, you think that these would actually work out to be the same, and they should, but this paper from Wang 2015 talks about how specifically on stable environments, which the beer game is, keeping a separate track of the state can help come up with more robust policies, which is shown in this work. So even though this is model free, I still like to think of it's model informed, because the architectural decisions that were made in creating this DQN were largely based upon sort of observations of what works when working in a multi-echelon supply chain. Some notes on that here. Specifically also back to that idea of the dueling structure, where we're keeping track of the state value separately from the action state pair, was very valuable in this particular setting in this training. And much like that single shot optimization that we talked about earlier, this is generally cost reducing. I should also then not state it's not universally cost reducing. It is, and we'll see this a little bit later on, it is on average cost reducing across the space. And this is one specific example of a wholesaler position in which it happens to be especially good at sort of tamping down on these oscillations that one sees in multi-echelon supply chains. Something to note, though, even going back to what we talked about before, this single shot cost reduction that was model constrained is actually not really model based. It's really model free in the same way that the DQN is. From the standpoint of the agent within the space, I'm essentially giving it a black box to interact with, much like the DQN that we made before. I'm simply telling it that it has 4 parameters, 4 knobs to turn within the space, and then I tell it, can you reduce some cost function? So it doesn't really know anything about its actual environment. So what we can do instead is actually give it an estimate of its environment. And that's this idea of sort of this online parameter optimization. It's very similar to model predictive control, for those of you who might be familiar with that. So in that case, part of the sort of input into this optimization engine is now an estimate of the model in which, the world in which it exists, how the people around it will behave given its current actions. And it can then go ahead and make its best decision given its best estimate of the environment in which it exists. This then gives us this sort of pseudocode, and my apologies for those of you who are better at writing pseudocode. This is a little messy, but ultimately what this boils down to is at some period of time, you assume a universe in which, if you're the agent, you assume a universe in which you're acting. You then go ahead and fit your observations that you've had so far to that model of the universe to update that model. And then you go ahead and choose your next course of action based upon a forward projection of your best guess, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. Go back through and interact one more time, update your model of the world, or at least your calibrated values under using your assumed state of the universe, and then optimize going forward. What's interesting, sticking with this single policy that's based around this heuristic rule, is you don't necessarily have to even learn the truth, if that makes sense, or if I'm saying that right. You have to just sort of learn something. You have to be able to be not static, and that's where the value comes in. So the circled examples here are specifically agents that interacted with their environment and learned, but the y-axis is sort of a metric of how close to the truth they landed on, and you'll note that there is still a bit of a gap. But it's that flexibility that's valuable, and this is kind of borne out directly in some more edge cases. So like here's one edge case in which without an agent, actually these models of human players do pretty darn well. You introduce a single shot agent that's static at time 0, trained on average, it's actually destabilizing within the space. You introduce this agent that's able to learn, and it is actually able to reduce costs, even if slightly, because it's not stuck in what those initial assumptions were at time 0. And also kind of an extent of that, it doesn't even necessarily have to have an entirely correct model of the world in which it's operating. This is taking that same agent, placing it in a similar but fundamentally different sort of definition of reality, and still allowing it to learn. And even within that sort of space, it's able to reduce costs simply because it's not static. So it does the best it can given its sort of fundamentally flawed model of the world. So going back to the DQN model, the question then comes, can we go ahead and get similar improvements by giving this totally model-free approach of creating a policy some estimate of the world in which it lives. And how one way we can do that is by adding that estimate, those parameters of the other players, or at least estimates of them, to its training sets, or sorry, to its observation set, I should say, to its state space that it can see. And honestly, for very low sort of number of training steps, giving this thing not a lot of time to actually construct a good model of how its actions relate to the world. Those blue squares that are on here are those ones that we gave it specific information about how the players around it would behave. It actually is an improvement. What becomes interesting, if you note that y-axis there, though, that's still ultimately destabilizing within this space. Once you start getting into a regime in which you actually start seeing improvement, in which you actually train this model well enough where it can actually reduce costs within the space, the additional value gained by giving it explicitly an external model of the world in which it exists is negligible at the end of the day. So part of my hypothesis here is that the state, you kind of have to think that the state that it sees is actually totally determined, aside from some initial conditions, about these other players' heuristics and how they react. So with enough training, this DQN can kind of back out its own estimate of how the world or how the other players around it are behaving, given its observable state variables. And this is kind of seen borne out more directly in these graphs. So this is now taking these agents that we trained and then applying them against teams that were modeled on actual human beings. So in this case, these are teams that were drawn from Sturman's original 1989 paper, and then more recent runs of the beer game over 2021 and 2022. This is the DQN. Again, generally, if you look at, especially look at the X's, which represent the means, and the horizontal lines, which represent the median, in this case, generally cost reducing. When you go ahead and now add in this agent, though, that's based on a much more simple heuristic rule, that then is updating a model of the world in which it exists. This is one in which it is a base stock agent that is assuming base stock others, but is actually in an environment with sort of these heuristic, more complicated heuristic others. That also implies a bit of an improvement. Even though it's a wrong model, it's still surprisingly robust, even though occasionally destabilizing. Now we go a little bit more detail. Now we have a base stock agent that is updating a model that is assuming behavioral others. So in this case, fitting a model that better reflects underlying physics of the system generally improves performance. What I think is interesting is this behavioral agent that assumes base stock others. So in this case, this is one where I'm giving the agent actually more degrees of freedom to make its decision, but I'm restricting its ability to model the world in which it exists. Is sometimes better if you look especially at the retailer, but often actually worse than a simpler model that has, or sorry, a simpler policy that has a better model of how the world works around it. And then of course, finally, sort of not unexpectedly, behavioral model, one that uses sort of a 4-parameter rule in this case based around a heuristic rule, but also is most accurately reflecting the underlying physics of the world in which it exists, gives sort of the better responses. An added bonus of using sort of these single shot agents or even this learning agent versus the open-ended DQN is you can interpret what it lands on since it's fitting a heuristic rule. So these are just kind of some general observations, which I've talked about in other presentations. And I'll kind of skip over for the sake of time. But really, something also I should really note here is that this is an empirically grounded simulation, but not empirically verified one yet. A big next step for me is then taking these various combinations of agents and policies and putting them in a real environment, in a real setting with real people. Additionally, I would like to say that kind of at the end of this, I think this is a step towards this idea of defining the value of the behavioral part of BOM, and it's kind of borne out, I think, most directly in this graph right here. And as I said before, I think one of my next steps is really to take this work and place it in a real environment with real people. And additionally, it also raises some questions about creating some more simple interpretable policies for managers in this case, of saying, okay, great, I have this heuristic policy that works and learns over time and adjusts its own behavior, but how did it adjust its behavior? What did it do given how its environment evolved? And then how can I turn that into real interpretable information that managers can take into an actively evolving supply chain crisis and hopefully reduce the bullwhip that they see in sort of their daily professional lives. So with that, I'll say thank you. I hope I get a chance to meet with you in person, and I hope you have an excellent rest of the conference.